So welcome everyone to those here and online to Buddha House, especially for those people who are new. So there are a few people here I don't recognise, so especially welcome. And so just very briefly, for those new people, maybe for those people online, could they just say, also, are the hands up here people who have very little background in Buddhism? Okay, maybe if the people online could just write in yes or no if they have no background or very little. Is that possible, that they could just let me know how many people? Anyway, we've got a few here already, so just very briefly, Buddha House is a part of a worldwide organisation called the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, which was established by a Tibetan monk and a Nepalese monk who are depicted on either side of the photo of His Holiness the Dalai Lama above the altar there. And they are my main teachers. And so my name is Thubten Dundrup. I've been a fully ordained monk. I come originally from Adelaide. I met the Dharma in Australia, got ordained in Australia, and I was away overseas in India and Nepal and France and Taiwan for quite a long time. I've forgotten now how long, 20 years or something, and maybe not that long. So I've been fully ordained in October for 41 years. So, and I'm the resident teacher here at Buddha House. So what I'm going to be talking about in relation to working with fear, of course, is completely from a Buddhist point of view. So to really, although this may sound pretentious, to really appreciate what I'm saying, the more background you have in Buddhism, the more, especially with the terminology and the concepts and believing them, the more useful it will be. But I'll try and explain some of the stuff as we go along, at least in a simple way. And anyway, hopefully some of what I say will be meaningful anyway, helpful in any way. Also, those people online will take a break at some point, and people online could send questions in. If people here have some questions, I can try and answer them. But just part of the tradition is at the beginning of a teaching or a talk, it's really important for what's being said to have the greatest impact on one's mind, the greatest benefit on one's mind. It's really important to listen with an open mind and to try to have a really good motivation for listening. So for the Buddhist people here online, the best motivation we can have is bodhicitta, that motivation wanting to realise our Buddha nature, our Buddha potential, so that we are in a position to repay the kindness of all sentient beings by helping them to become free of all suffering and its causes and helping them to achieve peerless, everlasting happiness. So this is the very best possible motivation we can have. But at the very least, we should have some motivation of wanting to understand what the Buddhist teachings are about, and if in order to use any that we feel beneficial and meaningful, to work with our mind and to put them into practice, so that we reduce and eliminate as much as possible our negative habits and ways of thinking and behaving, and increase our positive ways of thinking and behaviours and so on. And we can have that motivation at least for the benefit of this life. But if one has some understanding or belief in the continuity of lives, then it's better to have that motivation not just for this life but for all future lives, and also to try and have the motivation as much as possible to use the teachings if one feels that they're worthwhile, not just for one's own benefit, for the benefit of others. at least the human beings of this world, but if one believes in the existence of other kinds of beings, which Buddhists do, then one can extend it to all those beings. Anyway, there is a tradition that I should follow, I need to follow, of generating that motivation, and there's a traditional prayer that is said to help do that. So if you're interested, this prayer is the prayer of refuge in bodhicitta on page 8. So if you'd like to join in or just read it as I say it, please do so. And traditionally what we try and do when we say this prayer to make it more effective is we sort of think of the Buddha in front of us as a possible source of refuge, inspiration and guidance, and try and have a sense of all sentient beings surrounding us. Thinking of how they are suffering in all sorts of ways, and they've all been immensely kind to me, and how wonderful if I could eliminate all the negative tendencies of my mind, awaken all the positive qualities so that I can repay their kindness. So we normally say this prayer twice in Tibetan and one time in English. Sangye chedan zoge chonan la janjo bardo danne kyabzu chi darge jeje gi pesenum gi drola panjir sangye drupa shog. Sangye chedan zoge chonan la janjo bardo danne kyabzu chi darge jeje gi pesenum gi drola panjir sangye drupar shog. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, Dharma and the Supreme Assembly by the merits I create through listening to the Dharma. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So then if you find it helpful, one could imagine the Buddha coming to the crown of your head and then dissolving into light, and that blissful golden light pouring down into you, blessing your mind to be able to understand the teachings properly, blessing your mind to be able to put them into practice correctly, blessing your mind to be able to eventually gain the transformative realizations. And then just briefly, one can enhance that positive state of mind by doing some simple breathing meditation, just to allow the mind to become a little bit more calm, more clear, more concentrated, so that we can use that more subtle level of mind to listen to and think about the Buddha's teachings this afternoon. Okay, thank you. So because I'm presenting this, of course, from a Buddhist point of view, and there's some people who are not so familiar with Buddhism, then I always feel obliged. I have to try and give some little quick introduction to what Buddhism is all about. So I know some of you here have heard this a million times, but anyway, basically in the very essence of Buddhism is that it's all about working with our mind. And our mind is understood to be not the brain or something produced by the brain, although a very gross level of our mind does depend on the brain, But our mind is something quite different, because the brain is something physical, whereas the mind is something formless. It is like space. That the mind is defined as that which is clear and knowing, which implies that the mind is something formless, like space, but it does this most amazing thing that nothing else can do, which is to know. And knowing also means experiencing, and experiencing means feeling. So, the only way we have a sense of ourself, the only way we experience our body and everything else, the whole external phenomenal world, that all comes from our mind. And Buddhism is basically about understanding our mind so that we can be free of suffering, because all of us want to, we are all suffering in various ways, and we don't want that suffering. We all want happiness, but we don't really experience it. We experience it briefly, some kind of temporary, illusory happiness, but deep down, what we all really want, whether we're conscious of it or not, is a happiness that is complete, perfect, and lasting. And Buddhism says we can achieve that. We can be totally free of all suffering. We can achieve perfect, everlasting happiness. And it all depends on working with our mind, because happiness and suffering are all experiences of the mind. So the more we understand that, we can understand that the only way to have less suffering and more genuine happiness, more genuine lasting happiness, is really to work with our mind. But also one of the implications of the mind being something non-physical, that it's like space, is that our mind never ceases. Our body decays. All physical phenomena come to an end. But the mind, which is like space, it's not space, but it is like space, is something just like space. You can't destroy space. The mind goes on forever. And there's only two ways the mind goes on. It goes on with experiencing suffering, or it can go on to experience greater and more genuine happiness. And that depends on how we treat our mind, whether we take care of our mind or not. If we don't take care of our mind, we're going to keep creating the causes of suffering. And if we keep creating the causes of suffering, guess what? We experience suffering. But if we take care of our mind properly, then we will stop creating the causes of suffering and create more and more the causes of happiness. And if we do that, we will experience more and more genuine, lasting happiness. So to work with our mind, we really need a perfect, complete, lasting method. And this is why in Buddhism we put our trust, our refuge in the Buddha, because the Buddha represents a mind that is completely free of all faults and possesses every good qualities. And the Buddha says that all of our minds, every single mind has the same potential. We all have the potential to become Buddhas, to be enlightened, to be free of all suffering, to experience perfect happiness in a state of complete awareness, omniscient awareness, where we know everything and we know it in a perfect, unmistaken way. The trouble is, our mind, even though it has this Buddha potential, indestructible Buddha potential, the potential for perfect, lasting happiness, our mind is obscured. And that is because of that obscured mind, we experience what we call in Buddhism samsara. And because of that, we take rebirth over and over again. Sometimes good rebirths, such as a human being, sometimes bad rebirths as an animal, or there are even worse rebirths as hungry ghosts, or in different kinds of hell realms. We could have better rebirths as human beings, in the sense of more pleasure, which are the God realms. But all of these realms are samsara. They are in the nature of suffering. There's some pleasure, but it doesn't last. Suffering comes back. And the whole aim of the Buddha's teachings are to free us from cyclic existence so that we can eventually achieve this state of enlightenment, of peerless, everlasting happiness. So, from a Buddhist perspective, the most important thing to do in this life is not to sort of chase after the pleasures of this life and be so freaked out by the sufferings of this life. But the most important thing is to take care of our mind, to ensure that when we die, which we're all going to, that our next rebirth will be at least as good as this one, if not better, so that we can then have another good rebirth, so that we can work on our mind, eventually get out of samsara, eventually achieve enlightenment. But in the process of, because the happiness and suffering of this life is just like a finger snap in time compared to all our future existence. The suffering of this life is just that much, but the suffering of future lives could be everlasting if we don't do anything about it. And that pleasures and happiness of this life are just a finger snap compared to the possibility of everlasting happiness. And if one starts to really understand how Buddhism works and how taking care of the mind works, if we put the focus of this life on preparing for our future lives, on taking care of our mind, that is actually the very best way to take care of this life, to ensure that this life, the more we think about working for future lives, the more actually we will cause less suffering in this life, create more causes of happiness even for this life. But the more we think about this life, the more we tend to engage in negative actions and create the causes for more suffering in future lives, less happiness in future lives. Anyway, this is the Buddhist view in a nutshell. Right. So it's in that context I'm talking about working with fear. So anyway, the most important thing in this life is to take care of our mind, because no matter how much success we have in this life, we have a nice family, friends, good job, plenty of money, possessions, status, influence, all of those things, no matter how successful we are with all of those things, they're not going to last. Yeah? But also, during this life, even if we're successful with all of these things, whatever happiness, pleasure that can come from them is continually undermined by our uncontrolled mind. If we don't take care of our mind properly, skillfully, compassionately, we will always have an uncontrolled mind. And therefore, we can be so easily disturbed in so many different ways because we have no real control, no real mastery over our mind. And one of the many factors that disturbs our mind is fear. Right. I've got to the topic. You thought I would never, you were quite afraid I'd never get to the topic, but fear not. I've got to the topic. So there are countless objects of fear, right? One person can be afraid of this and another person has no fear of that, but is completely afraid of something else. But despite the countless objects that we can be afraid of, one can look at fear, I think, from there are two major kinds of fear, major types of fear, and each of those two major types of fear has two types of fear, aspects, right? So what are these? So the two super major categories of fear is there is what we could call wise fear, or meaningful fear, or positive fear, or helpful fear. You can give it lots of terms. I'm going to call it throughout this talk wise fear, because this wise fear arises because there are things that we should be concerned about that are harmful to us, that are validly harmful to us, to anyone in a sense. And and that wise fear is basically that ability to recognise that this person is trying to harm me, or this thing could harm me, this situation could harm me. Because if we can't recognise that there are certain kinds of dangers, then we're not going to do anything about it. Yeah. So there is a type of fear that is actually good to, and it's not only good to have, it's necessary to have, right? But then there is another kind of major category of fear, which is what I call ignorant fear, because it comes from ignorance. The Buddha said the very root source of all our suffering, why we're in samsara, why we experience any kind of suffering, from the smallest to the greatest, it all originates from our mind, from engaging in negative actions, creating negative karma. And we do that because we have all these different mental afflictions of afflicted desire, attachment, anger, jealousy, pride, all sorts of disturbing thoughts that we act on, engage in negative actions. And the only reason those afflictive thoughts, those negative, disturbing thoughts exist in our mind is because of this root affliction we have that obscures our mind, which is called ignorance, which prevents our mind knowing exactly, precisely, unmistakably how we actually exist and how all things exist. The Buddha is saying that everything we see right now, everything we hear, smell, taste, touch, think about, all of it is mistaken. It's an illusion. Things are not the way they appear. That they do exist. Trees exist, but the way we experience trees is not the way they really exist. We exist, but the way we experience ourselves is not the way we actually exist. And because of that, all of our disturbing thoughts arise, and because of that, all suffering arises. So this ignorant fear also comes from that ignorance. It's based on a wrong view of ourselves, a wrong perception of external things and the relationship between them. And basically, ignorant fear is really developing a fear and aversion towards things that really we don't need to be afraid of. That they are not really ultimately harmful to us. We may think they are harmful to us. Especially, anyway, we'll just keep it at that for the time being. So there are these two kinds of fear. So one, the wise fear, we actually need to cultivate to protect us from things that need to be protected. It's the ignorant fear that is something that we have to really work with to overcome. So the wise fear recognises things that are actually harmful and helps us to avoid the causes of suffering, whereas the ignorant fear creates this disturbed mind, this fear in relation to things that really we really don't need to be worried about, and that fear can it can lead to like total inaction. It can lead to panic, and especially, unfortunately, what it can lead to, because as that fear increases, to doing all sorts of really negative things that are actually, that really harm us. We fear something that we think is going to harm us, but in reality is not. But to protect us from this imagined harm, often we end up doing things that will cause us real harm. So ignorant fear is quite a disaster. So just going back to those two categories, with the category of wise fear, this has two subsections, right? I've just made up this, by the way. I haven't made it up. It's very surprising that in Buddhism, there's very little about fear. Like in Buddhist psychology, they list, there's something like 51 different kind of mental factors, and fear is not listed among them. Maybe because Buddhists aren't supposed to have any fear at all. But anyway, using what little Buddhist wisdom I've put together this. I've thought about this, and it is true. There is a wise fear. I haven't made that up. This is definitely something is courage, and other fear is just coming from ignorance and is really harmful to us. So anyway, this wise fear, we can have this wise fear in relation to two major categories. One is in relation to the things of this life. So there are things, ordinary things, worldly things that, it is wise, it is intelligent to recognise these are harmful, which are things like disease, dangerous people, dangerous animals, poisons, fire, floods, stuff like that. There are things that are harmful to us, validly. Jumping off cliffs. One should have a little bit of fear of, being on the edge of cliffs or things, right? It's helpful. But again, just make things a little more complicated. Even in that case, although it is helpful, it's important to have some fear of that, in the sense of recognising, I've got to be careful, this is potentially dangerous, or is actually, dangerous. That wise fear of those things could also turn into an unwise, ignorant fear of, reacting too strongly when it's not necessary. And then within the second category of wise fear is wise fear in relation to the spiritual life. And that is something really important to have. And basically that means developing a wise aversion to harming our mind, ultimately. That's what it's about. Because the more we understand that our mind is the source of all our happiness, and the uncontrolled mind is the source of all our suffering and leads us to bring great harm to others, then the most important thing in life is to take care of our mind. And one should have a wise fear, aversion of not doing that and doing the opposite, of engaging in negative actions, right? And everything related to that. That wise fear we need. It's really helpful to have some fear of the consequences of our negative actions. In fact, that is one of the most fundamental teachings of the Buddha, which all the other teachings are connected to, is the law of cause and effect. That negative actions produce always, whether we know an action we do is negative or not, There are things which are naturally negative. When we engage in them, they will always bring suffering to ourselves. Of course, they usually bring harm to others, but they always will bring great harm to ourselves, either in this life, but certainly through the ripening of the karmic imprints of our negative actions. They bring great suffering in the future lives. In fact, the Buddha says this, when we engage in a negative action in this life, it can produce for ourselves a certain amount of suffering in this life, but there is, at the same time, when we engage in negative actions, these negative karmic imprints or potencies or potentials are generated with our mind. And when they ripen, and they usually ripen in future lives, not always, some ripen in this life, but these seeds usually ripen in future lives. When they ripen, the suffering is far greater in intensity and the length of duration than the suffering we get from an action in this life. You know, we can kill someone in this life and get all sorts of suffering coming from that to ourselves. But the karmic result of killing can be lifetimes of misery. And not just as a human being. Right? So we should fear that. We should fear engaging in negative actions. And the point about this positive fear, this wise fear, is it's not panic. It's not this kind of fear. It is just that clear, sort of like recognition that this is really, really harmful and I have to be really careful not to do it because it's going to be really horrible if I don't. That we need. And the more of it we have, the better. The trouble is most of us don't have much of it. We happily engage in all sorts of negative actions. Think, I'll be okay, you know. Probably won't really be as bad as the teachings say. Or not for me, because I'm such a nice person. Yeah. So that, and part of my argument, I'll just present this now because actually this talk could get extremely long. Fear not, I'll try. I will stop at the right time. Really, I think the more we cultivate that fear, and we have that, and act on it, and basically practice the Dharma, practice the Buddha's teachings, really take care of our mind, protect our mind from the disturbing thoughts, protect our mind from engaging in all sorts of negative actions of body, speech and mind, the more we cultivate our mind, cultivate all these positive qualities we have, and each and every one of us, the Buddha says, we have every positive quality. Even the most horrible person in the world, deep down, has the potential of every positive quality, because that is the true nature of our mind. All these bad qualities we have, which we all do have, or the potential for, these are not true aspects of our mind. And because of that, we can get rid of them. But you can't get rid of the potential to be kind and patient and generous and loving and wise and compassionate, because they are intrinsic aspects, qualities of the mind. They are the mind. But the trouble is, right now, they're squashed a lot, they're obscured quite a bit. But we can cultivate them. And the more we do that, we will just naturally have less fear, this ignorant fear of fearing things that there's no reason to fear. That will come. Yeah, that's my belief. Definitely this will happen. Because, I'm jumping the gun here everywhere. Anyway, From a Buddhist point of view, one of the main reasons why we have ignorant fear is it is a karmic result. The more we engage in negative actions, harmful actions, the more we are creating the karma to experience the result sooner or later of fearing many things. And in fact, in the teachings on the law of cause and effect, it explains there is one of the 10 non-virtues we should avoid is called malice or ill will, which is basically based on very strong anger and hatred and a sense of revenge and that mind that really, really wants to harm someone and get back at someone and really, vicious mind. So we've all engaged in that in past lives. And one of the karmic results of that is, actually, one of the main karmic results is one gets reborn in a non-human, super-suffering state. But when one gets out of that state, then there are other karmic effects to be experienced from negative actions. And one of the karmic effects of malice is, for example, to have paranoia. Where there are people, who develop this paranoia where they fear various people. They're convinced these people are out to harm them. That paranoia can actually end up extending to everyone. They're convinced everyone is part of a huge conspiracy. I once met a lady when I lived in Taiwan who had quite an extreme form of paranoia, and she would become convinced by, someone would look at her for a few minutes and then she knew that person was part of the conspiracy to get her. And then someone else would say something and she knew. So her life was hell. Yeah. So this is ignorant fear where these people had probably weren't even aware of her, but she became terrified of them, convinced they were out to get her, and that's a karmic result. There's no explanation in this life. It is the result of generating this really harmful mind towards other people. This vicious mind towards others. You plant that imprint in your mind and it comes back to you. You see someone might be smiling at you and you know that smile is hiding hatred towards you. Yeah. So there's incredible fear. So the real answer to all fear, I think I'll end the talk now and keep it very quick. The real answer is just purifying the mind and cultivating, virtuous minds, states of mind. That's the real solution. Yeah. But I'll elaborate. So anyway, did I mention, with ignorant fear, again there are the two types. There's in relation to things of this life. So there are so many things that we fear in this life that there's no real reason to fear. Maybe from a worldly point of view, that we fear them, but from a more elevated view, from a spiritual point of view, there's no reason to have these fears. And in the teachings, many of you here would be familiar. I'll talk about this a little bit more later on. We talk about what are called the 8 worldly concerns. One of the greatest obstacles to following the spiritual path, the spiritual life, are what are called the 8 worldly concerns, where we are really we crave happiness. of course, we all want it, deep down we want this pure, lasting happiness, but this worldly concern is like an ignorant version of that, where we just crave the pleasures of this life, thinking that that's all there is. And our afflicted desire exaggerates how great and wonderful the pleasures and happiness of this life are, and also mistakenly grasp that it's permanent and going to last. And so the more we crave that, we fear not having this happiness or losing it. And a byproduct, and another of these worldly concerns is we crave getting stuff. But the trouble is, the more we crave getting stuff, we create a fear of not getting stuff. Or if we've got stuff, we fear losing it. And there's another worldly concern of craving sort of, what is it? Praise. People telling us how nice we are, how good looking we are, how intelligent, what sweet, lovely people we are. We crave that. And the more we crave that, the more we fear the opposite. Just that inevitably happens, whether we're conscious of it or not. The more we follow that mind wanting people to praise us and say we're nice and everything, and so we fear being blamed, and so whatever. And then what else do we want? What are the other two worldly concerns? There's praise and blame, and and also fame and shame. Or fame, or wanting to be well known and liked and so on, and acceptable. We really crave that. Or we can have that craving, but the more we crave that, wanting to be acceptable and loved and admired, etc., then unfortunately we're creating within our mind that fear that it won't happen, that we'll be rejected. Yeah. So we fear those things, but the point is that those fears about not having stuff and whatever they're unnecessary, because we don't really need much stuff. It's nice to have stuff, but it's amazing how little we really do need. And a lot of that craving for, now I'm talking about the eight worldly concerns, this craving for praise, for people telling us, you're good, you're good, you're blah blah blah. That comes from some. People telling us we're good doesn't make us good. This is the point. We have to recognise that we are okay. We don't need other people to tell us that. And if people tell us we're bad, doesn't mean we are. If we know we're doing the good, living a good life, developing kindness and compassion, etc., being generous and whatever, if people say we're bad, who cares? That can't really harm us. It can only harm us. Well, it harms us because we let those words harm us. Yeah. But if someone drops a rock on your head, that does harm you. But if someone drops a bad word on you, that doesn't really harm you, but it can harm us in the sense that our neurotic mind can be upset by it and we suffer. But the person and the words didn't make us suffer. It's our mind that did it, our way of thinking about that. Oh, you don't love me, you don't like me. Oh, people think I'm terrible, I must be terrible. We think about all that stuff and make ourselves miserable. And also fear to hear that kind of stuff. But it can't really hurt us. It can't really damage us. We let it do that, actually. We don't consciously do it, but we're letting ourselves be harmed unnecessarily. That's why I'm saying it's an unnecessary fear. It doesn't help us at all. And what it does, it leads us to do, we become desperate for approval, and therefore we can do all sorts of stupid and negative things. The more we crave this, the more we will fear that. And the more we fear that, the more, from a Dharma point of view, we end up engaging in all sorts of negative actions to get the praise of other people, or to get stuff, or to become famous and acceptable and loved and whatever. I was trying to present this talk in a logical way. Like I've said many times, I never used to prepare talks, but because of the live streaming, I've developed this fear of going wrong. So now it's all. But the trouble is, this is all very logical. But once I start talking, I start following another logic. So it's all. Anyway, where am I? So anyway, there are some fears, types of fear. I didn't finish. So that with ignorant fear, there's fear in relation to worldly things, and then there is, so that's unnecessary and harmful. But what is perhaps even more harmful is that ignorant fear, which is fear in relation to the spiritual life. We fear practicing the Buddha's teachings, because they're too difficult. It's too hard. I can't do that. It takes too long. God, it's a nice sunny day. I could be out having fun and things. Or trying to listen to the teachings is too hard to understand. It's boring. It's not entertaining enough. And sitting meditating is too hard. It takes too long. You're supposed to get all these realizations, I was going to take too long to get a realization. One fears all the difficulties. Or people think I'm a goody-goody, you're afraid, now he's gone all holy. We fear this. Again, that's a fear of bad reputation, but it's the wrong fear to have. And also we fear that we can't practice the Dharma because I'm so terrible, I'm not good enough. Other people can do all these good things but not me. We're afraid that we're not good enough. So that fear again is really a disaster. That's a really harmful fear. It's preventing us doing what is the most beneficial thing that we could possibly do. So just a little disclaimer I need to make is that I'm not a qualified counsellor or a psychologist. I'm just a Buddhist monk, and some kinds of fear, because they are so strong, may need specific counselling from qualified psychologists. But even so, having some understanding of a Buddhist point of perspective and Buddhist techniques can also maybe be helpful in that situation. So one general, but not necessarily a Buddhist way to deal with negative fear of any kind. This is a Buddhist technique, but you don't have to be a Buddhist believer to to engage in it and for it to be effective is, well, anyway, firstly, by way of introduction, working with fear doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of a particular fear or all fears. Rather, what working with fear is all about is learning not to give in to our fears. The negative ones. We should give into the positive fear that encourages us to do virtuous things. But what we need to learn to do with our negative fears is learn not to give into them, to be seduced by them, to believe what they're telling us. So courage is not the absence of fear. There's lots of things that people do that look incredibly brave, but in some cases why they're doing it is because they simply don't recognise there's any danger. So they're not being brave, they're not overcoming any fear. They just don't have any fear because any wise fear because they don't even recognise it's dangerous or potentially dangerous. So real courage is not the absence of fear, but it's the ability. Courage is the ability to not be overwhelmed by one's fear. It's the ability to go beyond it. One famous English poet, I think he was English, W.H. Auden, I think he was English poet, says, "We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in our dread than climb the cross of the moment and let our illusions die." Think about it. Basically, we're so attached to our illusions about ourselves and things that rather than do anything meaningful about it, we just get paralysed by our fear. Die in our dread. But we don't have to do that. We can go beyond our fear. And of course, this is not something easy. It's something that we have to train our mind to do. But one of my favourite themes is everything becomes easier through the power of familiarity. Everything can appear and be difficult simply because we're not used to it. But if we train our mind to do something, it will become easier and easier. In the teachings it says, nothing becomes more difficult through familiarity. Everything becomes easier through familiarity. So we just have to just work on dealing with our fear, facing our fear, whatever it is. So just to quote from one very famous Tibetan Lama, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, he says, acknowledging fear is not a cause for depression or discouragement. Because we possess fear, we are also potentially entitled to experience fearlessness. True fearlessness is not a reduction of fear, an absence of fear, less fear, but true fearlessness means going beyond fear. But to become fearless, first we have to experience fear. Fear has to be acknowledged in order to reconcile ourselves with it, in order to be fearless. So this begins by examining our fear and all the ways it manifests, because fear can also manifest as anxiety and nervousness and restlessness and so on. So one thing one can check up, a general method one can try out, is to realize that fear arises from our own thoughts. You know? The fear doesn't actually come from the object as such. It comes from us. We generate it. Yeah. If the fear came from the object, everyone would fear those objects. But there are some things, like there are people who do bungee jumping. I would not do bungee jumping. They don't seem to fear it. I fear it. I'm quite happy with that fear. I can live happily without bungee jumping, you know. So I'm afraid of doing that, or jumping off cliffs with a little bit of rubber band on your leg, and I'm okay with that fear. I'm not going to bother about getting rid of that one. But and some people are quite happy to jump off cliffs with a little bit of rubber attached to their leg, but maybe that's because they don't recognise the potential danger of it. Anyway, but yeah. So anyway, really the fear is coming from one's own mind, is generated by one's own mind, by one's own thought. And one thing to try and investigate is that our fear about it, you know, these irrational, negative, ignorant fears that we have about something or someone or a situation or whatever, these are including, you know, COVID-19 and so on. A lot of fear about that now. Is this fear comes? It arises depending on our own thoughts about something. They are thoughts about something. They are not a direct, unmistaken perception of something. They are thoughts about it. You know, they go around it. Here's the object, but you know, we have thoughts about it, not it. We don't directly perceive it. We have these thoughts about it.
So no fear is real?
What?
Are you suggesting that no fear is real?
No, it's real. It's real. That's why we have to deal with it. But it's based on something that's not real. It's thoughts about something. It's not the thing itself. It's thoughts about it. It's not inherently real, but it is real. It is existing. If it didn't exist at all, we wouldn't have to do anything about it. So our fear comes from thoughts about something. They are not a valid, direct experience of the object, of the person, the situation, whatever. They are our thoughts about it. And also this is something to really try and check, that these, what happens, not just with fear, but so many things, thoughts arise in our mind all the time, and most of us are not aware of them at all. You know, many people when they first learn to meditate say, "Oh, I can't meditate because I get all these thoughts, and I never used to have these thoughts before I tried to meditate. But now just when I'm trying to meditate, you tell me I'm not supposed to have thoughts. I have a million thoughts." But the point is they were always there, and we're just simply not aware of them. And what happens is, because we're not aware of our thoughts, what happens is we identify with them. We become those thoughts. Fear arises and we become a fearful person. Anger arises and we become an angry person. You know, hatred arises, jealousy arises and we become a jealous person. And well, if love arises, we become a loving person. Yeah. But the real problem is when the negative thoughts arise and we identify with them. And in other words, or another way of putting that, those thoughts become our reality. They are not reality. They're thoughts about something. They're not it. They're about it. Right? There's a big difference. We all tend to have opinions about famous people. We have never met them, but we have opinions about them. As though that we know the real person. And we don't. So to become aware that our fears are just our thoughts can be extremely helpful in weakening that, of reducing the potency of them, their effect to shake us up, to be mindful of that, to sit down quietly and just check. And the more we do that, the more, and become familiar with that, just to sit with that situation, just look at it and try to experience that, become aware that these are just thoughts. I'm going to get COVID-19, and I'm going to die, and I'm going to, or we think of all the other things that are going to happen, but then they become, to some extent, the reality, but we have no idea what's going to happen. But we're panicking about something that we've made up. It's not the reality. I mean, of course, COVID-19 is something that can harm us, so one should be careful. One should have a wise fear about it, but it can become an unwise fear, an ignorant fear, and that's what we have to look into. We have to check up.
Can I ask can it be difficult at times to discern between wise fear and ignorant fear when there is an element of risk? And what do you do then?
I think you just have to keep checking up. I mean, these things just don't happen overnight. One doesn't. What I'm trying to say is, we can't suddenly, deal with, think about that fear one time and it's gone. It's something that we have to just work on more. Check out.
By work, do you mean particularly meditation? Is that your main tool?
To look into those things, to investigate. But also, it's good to sit down and formally and do that and check. But also just, when these kind of fearful thoughts arise just during your daily life, you can just try and just label it that. You just kind of put the label, here it comes again, this is this fearful thought. And even just labeling it that can help kind of bring you back, weaken it a bit. But then you can just, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you can just kind of sort of look at it. What is it? Because also, what also one can do in relation to that is to really think, when these fears are there, what am I afraid of? What is it about this person or this situation or this thing? What is it that I am actually afraid of? That's one thing. What am I really afraid of? And another thing you can ask and check is why? Just firstly, what? What am I afraid of? What is there about that person or thing or whatever? What is it that I am afraid of? And then why am I afraid of it? Why am I really afraid of that? And of course, in terms of, and then to see, is that valid? To be, well, you can say, oh, I'm afraid of this because of this, this and that. But do I really need to be afraid of those for these reasons? Am I able to deal with those things? And then the next thing to ask is, who is afraid? Who is afraid? Who is this me that is afraid? What aspect of me is under threat?
Can you give us some examples of what sort of aspects?
No, I think that's too tricky because it depends what you're afraid of, perhaps. And it's a very personal thing. It's a very individual thing. I mean, for Buddhists who know something about the teaching, for Buddhists who know something about the teachings on emptiness, and there's the inherently existing I. You can try and see that this I that is afraid doesn't. It appears to exist, but it doesn't exist at all. So there's no need to be afraid. This I can't be harmed anyway. Yeah. But otherwise, just in a more general way, you can just kind of ask yourself, what is there about me that has to be afraid? What about me is going to be harmed? And is that valid? Is that really what will happen? That's one thing one can do. I can also remind everyone, some people would not know this, the old Buddhists here should know this, but the very famous quote from the great Indian Bodhisattva, Shantideva, who said, "Why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being unhappy about something if it cannot be remedied?" And the same applies. Why be unhappy about something, or why be afraid of something if there's nothing you can do about it? Because there's nothing you can do about it, and one's fear or being unhappy is not going to help. It's only going to make it worse. So why be afraid? And if there's something you can do about it, why be afraid? Because there's something you can do about it. That sounds incredibly simple. It is, but it's very profound. And I can say that because that comes from Shantideva, not like everything else I've said. Well, everything else I've said, I hopefully comes from the Dharma originally. Yeah. Because our fear just simply doesn't help. The wise fear does, because the wise fear motivates us to do something wise and virtuous and meaningful. But ignorant fear, at the most, it motivates us to do something stupid and harmful. And make the situation worse. Could we just take maybe a short break before I bombard you with some more? And if people have some questions online, they could send in. So maybe what? 10 minutes? 5 minutes? 10? 10. Okay.
You're on.
Okay, so I think we have one online question which I'll try and answer, which is?
This is from someone that does a bit of Buddhist stuff. Can we be attached to fear?
Can we be attached to fear?
Like bungee jumpers.
Sorry?
They love it. They love that sort of fear.
Who do?
Bungee jumpers.
Bungee.
That's what they do every weekend.
I think, yes, the self-cherishing mind can get attached to anything. Yeah, which I'd like to try and talk about self-cherishing as well. Possible, yeah. Yes, becomes habit. Yeah. The nature of the self-cherishing thought is it always takes the easy way out. So if it's easier to remain afraid than to do anything about it, the self-cherishing thought will just remain afraid. Like Mr. Auden says, I would rather die in my dread than change. Yeah? Than climb the cross of the moment. Climb the cross of the moment, isn't that amazing? Yeah. Just to experience the situation as it is. Anyway, there's many things to say, and there's not enough time to say them, but and especially to say them properly. But from a Buddhist perspective, I would say that the underlying basis of becoming fearless, that is, being able to, not be overwhelmed by one's fear, but somehow to go beyond it, to acknowledge it, but not be, controlled by it, is firstly understanding and accepting the very first teaching of the Buddha, which is there are the Four Noble Truths, and the first noble truth is that ordinary existence, meaning having a mind controlled by ignorance, delusion and karma, such an existence is in its very nature suffering. That all of us here, no matter how, we all, I think probably just the fact that we're here to some extent means we're lucky people, we're fortunate people, we have a much better life than many, many, many people on this earth. But we all suffer. We all suffer in various ways. And even the happiness, the pleasure we have is not real happiness. It's not this perfect, lasting happiness. It doesn't last. It can't last. All the human beings on this planet, all the animals on this planet are all suffering. All the beings in the universe, all the beings in cyclic existence are suffering. Nothing is perfect in our world. Yeah. And if you, for example, all the good things that have been, there may be some exceptions, but all the good things that have been invented in this world to make, with the idea of making life better, have a negative aspect to them, have had some bad side effects. Even medicines that cure something, they can be harmful for some people. Yeah. And motor cars were a great invention, but they've killed lots of people, and huge amounts of forest and everything have been destroyed to make roads and whatever, and there's all the pollution from them. Mobile phones are terrific in many ways, but also there's been all sorts of bad side effects from them, from all this horrible social networking, nasty social networking that's occurred and stuff like, that's happened, many unseen consequences. It's everything. That's the nature of our world. Yeah. This sounds very gloomy, but it's just simply the reality. That's how our existence is. And no matter how many good people come together, very intelligent people come together to solve problems, something goes wrong. Yeah. And so that's it. That's our reality. I mean, we can become free of it. The Buddha's teachings, we can become free of that, but samsara itself, samsara will always be samsara. We can get out of it, but while we're in it, that's its nature. And to know that and accept that is incredibly helpful. It can sound very depressing, and most people live their life denying the truth of existence. But that denial is suffering. Denying reality doesn't change reality. So really knowing that life, suffering is there all the time. Either obviously or it comes around. It's actually there all the time. Sometimes it's hidden by what we call happiness, which is just temporary and illusory. And then some real suffering comes, the more obvious stuff, but it's actually there all the time. So then when COVID, if we really, not just in a very superficial intellectual way, but when we've deeply integrated that into our mind, that is the situation we're in, when some disaster comes, a nasty person comes along, wars start, disease, plagues start, pandemics start, it won't bring so much fear. Because that's an integral part of ordinary existence, actually. Just a quote from Shantideva, he says, the causes of happiness sometimes occur, but the causes for suffering are very many. Without suffering there is no renunciation, therefore mind, you should stand firm. In other words, suffering is all around us. It's kind of a miracle to have a bit of happiness. But suffering is always popping up. Obvious suffering is always going to pop up. I'm sorry, but that's it. So keep the mind firm. Don't give in to any fear. Focus on developing the wise fear to get us out of all that. Not the negative fear that keeps us in it. So the whole aim of Buddhist teaching is for us to be completely free of suffering, and we can do that because it's all an unnatural aspect of our mind. But the only way to be free of suffering is to stop creating the causes. If we stop the causes, the effect stops, right? But to stop creating the causes of suffering that we are trapped in, we can't just do that like that. It is going to take time, unfortunately, right? Many lives. So in the meantime, we are going to be in samsara. So the thing is, in order to be able to stop suffering completely, not just temporarily, superficially, but in order for each of us to stop our samsara, because samsara is not something out there, samsara is our mind controlled by delusion and karma. Each of us has our own, our very personal samsara. Yeah, unfortunately. Now I've lost my point. Yeah, anyway, to be completely and totally free of suffering forever, what we have to learn to do as a Dharma practitioner, if that's what we want to be, is we have to learn to be able to tolerate suffering now. Because if we can't tolerate suffering now, we will, in order to, if we can't tolerate it, we can't bear it, then we will react to it in unskillful ways, which means we'll create the cause for more suffering. And so it'll never stop. But if we can bear suffering, then we can stop creating its causes, purify the negative karmic imprints already in our mind, and start creating, use our energy to create the causes for liberation and enlightenment.
So you mean that we become a friend of suffering?
Sorry?
To become a friend of suffering?
A friend of suffering, you could call it that, yes. Yeah. So what my teacher Lama Zopa Rinpoche once said, the difference between ourselves and bodhisattvas are beings who have generated this genuine commitment, determination to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. So they are incredibly courageous, brave beings. And that's what the Mahayana teachings of the Buddha are encouraging all of us to become bodhisattvas, to become these warriors, spiritual warriors, following the path to enlightenment. Then Rinpoche says the difference between us now and bodhisattvas is that we, because we're controlled by self-cherishing, we are very afraid of suffering, but we are very brave in creating the causes of suffering. Because we're only brave because we do it ignorantly. We're not even aware most of the time that we're creating the causes of suffering. But we're very willing to create the causes of suffering. But when the suffering comes, we're very afraid of it. Whereas a bodhisattva is very brave in bearing suffering, but is very frightened of creating the causes of it. Because they have that wise fear of creating the cause of suffering, but they don't have that ignorant fear of suffering. Or the ignorant fear that can't temporarily bear suffering. And also my teacher Lama Zopa Rinpoche once said, the most important fear to have is to fear the misery of future lives rather than the misery of this life. In other words, we need to be able to bear the suffering of this life in order to avoid creating the causes for more suffering in future lives. In other words, we need not to give in to this fear of suffering, this irrational fear, this unhelpful fear. And to some extent that comes from just simply accepting, I am going to suffer in this life. We are all going to suffer in this life. It's inescapable. We're all going to get sick sooner or later, or have many sicknesses in our life. We're all going to grow old, and the older we get, the more suffering. And we're all going to die. And what makes all of that suffering worse is our fear of it. And a part of that fear arises from all these wrong views we have, thinking this shouldn't happen. Yeah? Something is wrong, but actually it should happen because we're constantly creating the causes. And we created the causes in the past and are getting the effect now. So the more we understand that, there's really understand it, really accept it, then that helps us bear the situation. But if we see, the trouble is, many of us, most of us, much of the time, live our life thinking, and this is again due to the self-cherishing thought, that it's embarrassing to admit this because it's so stupid and egotistical, but we all tend to have this, is we live our life somehow expecting that everything should just happen the way I want it. It should be sunny when I want it. And if I don't want it to be sunny, I'd like it to rain, it should rain. And everything should go my way. Now. Exactly. And we get very upset when the more we demand that, and all of us, if we're really honest, have that mentality. Not all the time, fortunately, but it is there. But the more we have it, the more we get upset when it doesn't happen, and we feel what's gone wrong. Yeah. But if we can understand the first noble truth, that, samsara is the pits. It's a mess. Things fall apart all the time. Things go wrong. And also what is incredibly helpful, again, sounds depressing at first, but what is one of the most helpful teachings in the Buddha Dharma is that the Buddha points out again and again, and that everything in our world is impermanent. It's changing all the time. Everything in our world, starting with our own body, has arisen depending on causes and conditions. And the Buddha says, if you check up, everything that arises depending on causes and conditions is impermanent, meaning it changes moment by moment, it decays moment by moment, it becomes something less moment by moment. Everything, even the most solid looking things are impermanent. And they're changing all the time, every moment. And which also means that everything comes to an end. We are going to die. So also knowing that, accepting that, is incredibly helpful. Because so many people, death is all around us, but we just don't want to know about it. And it always comes as a huge shock. And it's a sense that this should not be happening. Or why is it happening to me or my friends? But actually it is an absolute natural ingredient of our samsaric existence. But the more we are unaware of that, and the more we mentally rejected it, it shouldn't be like that, I don't believe that, it's not like that. Every time we're confronted with the reality of it, it's shocking. Actually, if you think about it, virtually all the fears we have are fears about things being damaged, destroyed, or dying, which is all of the same thing, impermanence and death. We fear me being damaged or dying. We fear our family, friends, our possessions. That's what we fear. It's all about that. But the Buddha says, and of course the Buddha didn't make this up. This is not like some little theory that the Buddha has, where if you're a Buddhist you believe this. This is the reality. This is, it's undeniable reality when you check that everything in our world is impermanent. And like a sound of a bell, it's way over there. Anyway. That doesn't last very long. But if you hit a bell, it makes a sound, and that sound gets quieter and quieter and quieter, and eventually it stops. Yeah? Because it has no ability to be permanent, to last. It just naturally fades away moment by moment. Because that sound originated depending on causes and conditions, and everything in this whole universe, starting with this body and the clothes we're wearing, the food we eat, the medicine we take, the houses we live in, the cities we live in, the world we live on, all of it is like the sound of a bell. It is no more solid and lasting than the sound of a bell. So the more we have really let that absorb into our mind, not just like some superficial words at the tip of your lips, then that really helps to become fearless. Not to be shocked that this, I'll just say one more thing, if that's okay. I just have to quote one of my favourite quotes from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, which is, summing up many of the things I'm saying, is that Lama Zopa Rinpoche once said, "One way of thinking brings every kind of suffering, and one way of thinking brings every kind of happiness." So we have to learn to think in the right way, to become fearless. And that basically means accepting things as they are, not how we would like to make them be. There's two things I want to say. Might take a while. One is one of the main bases of fear is self-cherishing. The more self-cherishing that we have, the more fear we will have. Because what is I've talked about it a lot lately. It might drive some people crazy, but some people may. This is a very important concept in Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism. And the self-cherishing thought, it sounds like something good, that we should cherish ourselves. And of course we should love ourselves and take care of ourselves, but the term self-cherishing is not referring to that. Self-cherishing is a completely negative state of mind, because the self we are trying to cherish in that is a self that doesn't exist. It's the wrong view of self that we have, that is actually the source of our suffering. And the way we try and cherish this self is not by generating love and compassion, etc., but by following afflicted desire, attachment, pride and jealousy, and anger. And we follow anger to protect ourselves, whereas in reality, anger harms ourselves. And the nature of the self-cherishing thought is that, it distorts this natural wish for genuine, lasting happiness into just wanting momentary pleasure, momentary distraction, momentary entertainment. Yeah. So the more we crave that, to be happy right now, the more we have that craving, which we all have that, we give into that regularly, expecting, demanding to be happy right now, or for things to go my way right now. The more we allow ourselves to get into that state of mind, we create unknowingly the very opposite, which is the inability to bear things not going my way right now, the inability to not to be able to bear suffering happening, problems happening, difficulties happening, and therefore generating the fear of them. And that's what the 8 worldly concerns are. The 8 worldly concerns I talked about. Remember, craving ordinary happiness. And the more we crave it, the more we fear suffering. The more we crave getting stuff, the more we fear losing it. Or fear, I'll never have this. Yeah. So self-cherishing, and so all of these worldly concerns are aspects of our self-cherishing, which I usually call the easy, happy now mentality. Self-cherishing wants to be happy now, and it wants to be happy quickly. So if we can't be happy now and quickly and easily, we can't bear it, and we fear not being able to achieve it. That fear is embedded in self-cherishing. And the very essence of self-cherishing basically comes down to attachment, afflicted desire and attachment. Attachment, usually in our language, probably by the dictionary meaning, is related to feeling affection for beings, but here attachment doesn't mean that at all. Attachment is based on afflicted desire, and you get attached, you get stuck. You get stuck, you get dependent and reliant, unnecessarily dependent and reliant on what you desire. And with attachment embedded in attachment is fear, the fear of losing what one can't bear not to be with. You desire something, this is so beautiful, this is happiness. So we have this afflicted desire, believing this will make me happy and it'll make me permanently happy. So we get attached to it. We can't bear to let go of it. We become dependent on it. We become willing to do anything to protect this. So we get angry to protect us, thinking this is going to protect us and so on. But so embedded in that attachment is fear. The fear of losing what we're attached to. The fear of, I can't bear. Here I go again. There's that great song. I can't live if living is without you. Do you know that song? I could burst into song, but I won't do it. It's accompanied by, strings and swelling music. And there's this great love song, I can't live without, if living is without you. And you think, oh, isn't that wonderful? That we're supposed to think, oh, isn't that wonderful? But that is such a depressing message. And that's what we're telling ourselves. Oh, I can't live, I can't be happy if I don't have you, and I don't have this, and I don't have that. But the Buddha is saying, we can. We can be fantastically happy. Because we've got Buddha nature. If we just cultivate our inner qualities, we'll be fine. I mean, you can have, all these nice people as well, but, basically, it's in there. I think I'm now waffling on. Am I waffling on? No. So the less self-cherishing we have, the less fear there will be. The less attachment we have, the more fear. You know, in the teachings it says, you know, when we die, we're all going to die, and to get a good rebirth, it's really vital that we die with a peaceful mind. That is the single most important thing, and the single greatest obstacle to dying with a peaceful mind is our attachments. Because great fear will arise of being separated from the things we're attached to. That's when the fear becomes really apparent. But it motivates so much of what we're doing in our life unconsciously. So, yeah. Finally, now I'll just briefly talk. One of the great antidotes to fear also in developing, cultivating, it may not look like it, but it is developing compassion. The more genuinely compassionate we are, the less fear we will have, or the more we'll be able to go beyond our fear in the sense of being able to not be overwhelmed by it. Because fear, one of the aspects of fear, it has this quality of withdrawing, you know, sinking inside and shutting up, you know, shutting down, you know, withdrawing, because there's that fear. Whereas compassion is about opening oneself up to others and having empathy for them. Actually, Shantideva mentions in the Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life text that Chenrezig, the Buddha of compassion, blessed his name to protect us from fear. So when we're feeling fearful, we should think of the Buddha of compassion, Chenrezig, and recite the mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. This can protect us from fears. But actually really generating compassion, because compassion is the mind that can open itself. You know, normally because of our self-cherishing, we don't want to know about suffering. We don't even admit our own suffering, but we certainly don't want to know about the suffering of others, and we don't want to feel the suffering of others because we're afraid of that, because we think we can't bear it, but actually we can. Yeah. And by being compassionate, by developing our potential for compassion, we can bear our own suffering, bear the suffering of others, and that makes us courageous. Yeah. The more courage we have, the more compassionate we can be. The more compassionate we are, the more courageous we can be, and the more, we can become fearless in the sense of not being overwhelmed by our fear. And just finally, I've just got to say this. Fear not, I will stop. In relation to developing, one of the big fears we can have is fearing other people, individuals or a bunch of people or whatever. And one of the great antidotes to that one can practice is practicing equalizing oneself with others, of realizing that we are all, there's many differences between us in many ways, in our appearance and customs and behavior and thises and that's. And if we focus on those, that can activate all sorts of prejudices and pride and jealousy and all sorts of negative states of mind. But if we focus on what is similar between us all, that can awaken a sense of empathy, compassion, love, etc., because we can see the basic similarity. And we're all similar in that basic, all human beings, but not just all human beings, we are similar with all animals, all sentient beings, because the very nature of every sentient being is We just want happiness and we don't want suffering. There is not a single human being who doesn't want to be happy. There is not a single human being who doesn't want to be free of suffering. And every animal is the same. We're no different than any animal. You know? They just want to be happy. They don't want to suffer, just like us. No difference. No difference. And in conclusion, I'd just like to make, many years ago, Professor Jeffrey Hopkins, who's this amazing teacher of Buddhism, Buddhist scholar, he often, years ago, he used to translate for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but he's an incredible scholar of Tibetan Buddhism. He gave a talk at Chenrezig Institute in Queensland, where I lived when I was first a monk, and he made this point that when you're walking down the street and you see someone and that person looks really scary, he says, there's no reason to be scared because, or with anyone you see, because actually we know something very, how did he put it? We know something very private about each and every individual we meet. We don't know them, they're complete strangers, but there's something very, very private about them that we know. And that is, that person just wants to be happy, just like me. And they don't want to suffer, just like me. That's one of the best things I've ever heard. So there's no need to be afraid. They may have a knife in their hand, so you can take some precautions. But, they're just trying to be happy, just like me. Thank you very much. I hope I've said at least one thing that's been intelligent and helpful. And we can dedicate, if you like, the positive imprints we've generated. So if you'd like to join in, there's traditional prayers on page 9. Through the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. May the precious right view, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.